You already know something is off. Maybe you can't name it exactly. It's not dramatic enough to be a crisis. It's more like a tiredness that doesn't fully lift. A sense that recovery takes longer than it used to. A quiet, low-grade suspicion that something inside has been shifting and that the shift started before you were ready to notice them. If that sounds familiar, stay with this. Because what comes next isn't another list of supplements or another morning routine designed by someone who has never felt what you're feeling. This is something different. Make a fist. Right now, wherever you are, feel it. The pull across the base of the fingers. The finding wasn't buried in isolation. It declines together with the heart, together with the brain, together with the slow, inflammatory feel, a signal you can actually work with instead of another vague warning to reduce your stress and sleep more. There are 7 things the body may already be broadcasting about its biological age after 50. Grip strength is one of them. But it isn't the first on the list, and the reason it isn't the first will change how you understand everything else. What we're building here is a complete picture, grounded, verifiable, honest about what the research actually says and what it doesn't. You don't need to be afraid of what your body is telling you. You need to be able to hear it. That's what this is for. There is a moment most men over 45 have had, and almost no one talks about afterward. You're in a waiting room, or maybe already inside the room with the paper on the table and the smell of antiseptic that never quite fades, and a doctor is moving through a checklist. Blood pressure cuff, heart rate, The questions you already know are coming. And somewhere in the back of your mind is the thing you actually came in wanting to ask. Not about any specific symptom, but something harder to name. Whether the body you're living in is heading somewhere you should know about before you get there. That question rarely gets answered. Usually, it doesn't even get asked out loud. This is where grip strength becomes important. Not because it is dramatic, not because it requires anything from you. No fast, no blood draw, no machine you have to schedule 6 weeks in advance. A handheld device, roughly the size and weight of a thick door handle. You squeeze it for a few seconds. The room is still. The number appears. And that number, it turns out, contains more information about where your body is going than most men ever receive in a standard appointment. A study published in The Lancet, not a wellness blog, not a branded podcast. The Lancet tracked nearly 140,000 adults across 17 countries over 4 years. Every 11-pound decrease in grip strength was associated with a 17% increase in cardiovascular mortality, a 16% increase in dying from any cause at all, a 9% increase in stroke risk. The researchers were not measuring athletic performance. They were not measuring how much you lift or how fast you run. They were measuring something the body had already decided about itself, quietly, long before any crisis arrived. When you actually sit with that for a moment, not skim it, sit with it, it lands differently than a statistic usually does. Here is why this finding means what it means. Your hand is not what is being measured. Your hand is a window. The grip is an output of the entire musculoskeletal system. Lean mass, the efficiency of the signals your nervous system sends to muscle, the body's ongoing capacity to build and repair contractile tissue. When that output drops, it reflects something happening across the whole system, not in your palm. Grip strength correlates with leg strength and core stability. It correlates with how your body handles glucose and manages inflammation. It correlates with how quickly you recover from illness, with bone density, with cognitive function, processing speed, memory, the risk of meaningful decline a decade from now. One number in your hand carries a reading on most of those systems simultaneously. That is what makes it useful. Not what it measures directly, but what it reflects. And what it reflects is a direction, not a destination. A direction, because the men in those studies who showed low grip strength at 55 were not facing a fixed outcome. They were facing a trajectory, one that had been building for years through choices and circumstances that, in most cases, were neither permanent nor sealed. The research does not describe a condemned structure. It describes a structure that has been trending a particular way for reasons the body has been signaling the whole time. That word, signaling, is the one worth carrying forward. Most men do not receive this information in the 15-minute appointment, not because the doctor is withholding it, because the appointment is not built to deliver it. The medical system is built around treatment, around the moment the fall happens, the intervention, the event. It is genuinely good at that. It is organized and funded and trained for the crisis. What it has almost no architecture for is reading the signals the body sends in the years before the crisis arrives. Grip strength does not generate a prescription. It does not generate a referral or a billable code. And so it stays in the journals. It stays in the conference presentations. It almost never makes it into the room with the paper on the table. That gap is where this channel lives. not to alarm you, not to hand you a diagnosis or replace the physician who knows your actual history, but to bring you what is already public, already proven, already indexed in medical literature that was never designed to reach you directly, and to treat it as the actionable information it actually is. There are 7 signals. Grip strength is the first one, and it is first for a reason. Once you understand what a hand squeeze in a cardiologist study is actually measuring, once you absorb why it outperforms systolic blood pressure as a predictor of cardiovascular death in some populations, the other 6 signals stop looking like separate facts. They start to organize. They start to speak the same language, the language the body has been using the entire time. Some of what the body has been tracking does not require a dynamometer. Some of it is visible in how you move through a room. Some of it shows up in numbers you have already been given and never fully decoded. Some of it is quieter than that, slower, subtler, the kind of signal that a man in his 50s dismisses as normal aging right up until someone shows him it is not normal and it is not aging. By the time you have moved through all 7, something will have shifted, not just in what you know, in how you stand inside what you know. That is what this information is built to do, not to frighten you toward action, but to give you enough of the picture that action becomes the obvious and grounded response. You came in with a question you may not have put into words yet. The signals are how we start answering it. You already know the feeling, even if you have never named it. Why a door handle that requires more than it used to, a handshake where something registers in the palm and then gets quietly filed away, unmentioned. Nothing happened. Nothing was wrong, exactly. And yet something was communicated in the only language the body has: sensation, resistance, force, the small arithmetic of diminishment. That moment is not emotional. It is informational. And the science that has accumulated around it, serious science, the kind that does not make headlines twice, suggests it is also something else. It is a reading, a status report from a system that has been generating data about you for decades, whether or not you thought to ask for it. Here is what the research actually found, and the scale of it matters before anything else. The Pure Study, Prospective Urban-Rural Epidemiology, followed over 140,000 people across 17 countries for 4 years. Not a pilot study, not a press release dressed as data. 140,000 individuals tracked from rural Nigeria to suburban Canada to the dense cities of South Asia, across income levels and dietary patterns and activity habits and age brackets. At the start of the study, researchers measured grip strength. Then they watched what happened. Every 11-pound decrease in grip strength correlated with a 17% higher risk of dying from any cause, a 17% higher risk of cardiovascular death, and a 9% higher risk of stroke. The associations held everywhere, across cultures, across continents, across every variable the researchers controlled for. The magnitude, in the words of the researchers themselves, was surprising. And then there's the specific finding that landed differently inside the scientific community, the one that deserves to be stated plainly without softening. Grip strength predicted cardiovascular death more accurately than blood pressure did. Read that again, not as a provocation, but as a statement about measurement. Blood pressure monitoring is the foundational ritual of modern cardiac prevention. It is the first thing every physician does, every visit, every year. The entire architecture of preventive cardiology is organized around it. And in a study of 140,000 people across 17 countries, the force a person could generate by closing their hand was a stronger predictor of cardiac death than the number on the cuff. The Lancet published this in 2015. It was not obscure, not contested. It was received as serious science, acknowledged with appropriate gravity, and then, with remarkable efficiency, filed somewhere between interesting and actionable, and largely left there. The Pure study was not alone. A 2018 meta-analysis in the Journal of Cachexia, Sarcopenia, and muscle pool data from dozens of independent studies and arrived at the same structure of findings. Reduced grip strength linked to increased risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, cancer, cognitive decline, falls, fractures, hospital readmission. Every finding pointed the same direction. Not because grip strength causes these outcomes, but because it surfaces something the body is already doing or has already stopped doing. That distinction carries more weight than it might seem to at first. Grip strength is not the condition. It is the display, the external register of something systemic, something that runs far beneath any single muscle group. When the researchers measured the hands, they were reading the whole. The hand is where the body writes its current status in a language legible enough to correlate with death across 140,000 people on 5 continents. A 2020 study from the University of Michigan, drawing on the Health and Retirement Study, a nationally representative survey of Americans over 50, running continuously since 1992, found that grip strength was consistently associated not only with physical health outcomes, but with cognitive function, memory performance, executive function, processing speed. Mesurable consiste association. The hand was not just reporting on the heart, it was reporting on the brain. And the cumulative picture, when you read it without the hedging that academic language deploys as a matter of convention, is this: the body of the person watching this has already generated an answer to the question of biological status. Not a future event, not a projection, a present condition stored in the tissues, expressed through the grip that either generates force or does not. There's a particular texture to sitting with that, not fear. Fear is not the point here, and it is not useful. Something quieter than fear. The feeling you get when you realize a key has been in the wrong pocket the whole time. And the problem was never that the key didn't exist. It was that you were looking somewhere else. The science does not arrive to frighten. It arrives with precision. And what it delivers across these sample sizes and replication rates is not a warning about what might happen. It is a reading of what is already happening, has been happening, registered in the body with complete indifference to whether it was noticed. What the science cannot answer is the thing that gives this story its weight. If the body has been accumulating evidence for decades, and if that evidence currently points somewhere you would not choose, the question is not whether the reading is accurate. The question is whether the system taking those readings is still open to new information, and if so, what that information has to look like to actually change anything. Whether what has been written in the tissues can be written differently. That is not a rhetorical question. It is the one the research eventually turns to, and is where this goes next. There's a feeling most people carry without naming it. A low-grade fatigue that isn't quite tiredness. A background tension that isn't quite stress. Something that shows up in the morning before anything has happened. before the phone, before the news, before any reason to feel the way you already feel. And because it never sharpens into a specific symptom, because there is no single moment of onset you can point to, you learn to move around it. You learn to call it getting older. You learn to call it life. But in 2012, a paper appeared in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology that offered a different framing for what the body might be trying to say. Not through a scan, not through blood work, not through any of the instruments medicine typically reaches for. Through a floor, through the act of getting down onto one and then getting back up again. The lead researcher was a Brazilian cardiologist named Claudio Gil Uraho. He had spent years looking for something fast, cheap, and repeatable, a way to take a real-time reading of what he called musculoskeletal fitness without a single piece of equipment. Not strength in isolation, not flexibility in isolation. The whole integrated system at once. And what he discovered, tracking more than 2,000 adults between the ages of 51 and 80, was this: people who scored in the lowest range on this simple sitting-rising test, who needed multiple hands, multiple points of contact, multiple negotiations with gravity just to stand up from a seated position on the floor, were nearly 6 times more likely to die within the following 6 years than those who scored in the highest range. 6 times. Not a marginal adjustment to a risk curve. 6. Try it now, if you're somewhere you can. Not to perform. Not for anyone watching. Sit down on the floor, cross-legged, however the body allows, and then stand back up without using your hands. Feel what happens. Feel where the hesitation lives. Feel what the body reaches for before it finds it. There's a particular quality to the moment right before you decide you need the chair, the wall, the edge of the table. A sort of internal negotiation, a dimming of confidence somewhere below the level of thought. That negotiation is not a personality trait. It is a biological signal. The test is scored on a scale of 0 to 10. 5 points for the descent, 5 for the ascent. 1 point deducted for each hand or forearm used as a brace. Half a point lost for each wobble, each catch, each moment where the body had to improvise its way through a movement that should, in a well-maintained system, arrive without deliberation. The floor has no opinion about you. It has no interest in humiliating you. It is simply hard and flat. And asking a question the body already knows the answer to, the question of whether the systems that are supposed to be working together still are. What the test is actually measuring is not flexibility the way a stretch class measures it. It is the body's capacity to organize itself against gravity, to recruit simultaneously from every available resource, the deep muscles of the hip, the stabilizers of the spine, the proprioceptive network that tells the brain where the limbs are in space without looking, the motor coordination that sequences the whole movement into something smooth. When those systems are communicating well, you stand up cleanly. When they have started to fragment, when the dialogue between nerve and muscle and balance has started to lose signal, you reach for something outside yourself. That reaching, quiet and almost involuntary, is what the researchers learned to read. And here is why cardiologists were the ones who noticed. Because the degradation that makes rising from the floor harder is not local. It is systemic. Chronic low-grade inflammation, mitochondrial inefficiency, declining motor neuron density, reduced circulation in the small vessels feeding deep muscle tissue. These are not separate conditions running parallel tracks. They are the same underlying process, accelerating simultaneously toward cardiac risk, toward cognitive fragility, toward every category of all-cause mortality that medicine tracks. The floor test is not testing one system. It is sampling all of them at once in 10 seconds at zero cost. Arho described it carefully because scientists speak carefully by saying that someone who can sit and rise from the floor using just one hand, or better, no hands at all, is likely to have the strength, flexibility, balance, and coordination for daily life, and their cardiovascular prognosis is probably better than a less capable peer. Probably better. That is a sentence doing enormous work in very few words. Underneath, it is something more direct. The body has been broadcasting. Most people have not been listening, which is why the broadcast matters more than the score. Not the number, not the grade. The information beneath the grade about what the system is doing in every other moment, in every other movement, in every other signal it generates that no one has taught you to read. Because the body is not transmitting one signal. It is transmitting dozens, continuously, at frequencies most people have never been told to tune toward. Grip strength is another signal. Heart rate variability during sleep is another. The quality of balance with eyes closed. The time your vision takes to adjust when you move from light into dark. The speed a small wound closes. The way fatigue arrives, whether it comes at the end of effort or before effort has begun. The sitting-rising test earns its place at the front of this countdown, not because it is the most scientifically complex of what we're moving through, and not because the number it produces is the thing that matters most. It earns its place because it is immediate and physical and mercilessly honest. You know your age. You have known it your whole life. What you may not know, what most people in their 50s and 60s have genuinely never been handed away to know, is what the body says about its own age. Its functional age, its biological age, registered in tissue and tendon and nerve signal, not on any calendar. Those two numbers are not always the same. Sometimes the gap runs in a direction that is quietly reassuring, and sometimes it runs the other way, and the gap itself, that distance between what the calendar says and what the body says, is among the most important pieces of information a person can receive. Not because it delivers a verdict, because it arrives early enough to mean something, early enough to change something. The floor is not a judgment. It is a question, and the body, if you stop moving around it for long enough, has been asking it for years. But rising from the floor is only the beginning of what the body is trying to say. Because if one 10-second movement can carry enough information to predict mortality risk across a decade, if gravity and a hard surface can read what years of lab work might miss, then consider the rest. The breath that shortens before a difficult conversation. The shoulder that rises toward the ear in certain rooms around certain people. The heaviness that appears in the chest before the mind has formed a thought about why. The body is not a container you live inside. It is a system in continuous dialogue with everything around it and everything inside it. And some of what it is broadcasting has nothing to do with muscle fiber, cardiovascular output, or motor neuron density. That layer is coming. But there are 6 more signals first. 6 more places where the body has been speaking clearly, specifically, and without ambiguity to anyone willing to learn to read the frequency. Signal 6. If you came here carrying something heavy, a tightness you can't fully explain, a low hum of dread that started somewhere around the time the news became something you brace for rather than reach for. Then stay with that feeling for a moment before we move into the science. That feeling is not noise. It is the exact subject of this chapter. The body registers the world before the mind makes sense of it. And what it registers shows up in places most people never think to look. One of those places is the hand. Pick up something right now. A mug, a pen, the arm of a chair. Feel the pressure you apply to hold it. That pressure is not random. It is generated, sustained, and modulated by a system so ancient and so complex that modern medicine spent decades measuring only the peak of it, how hard a person could squeeze at their strongest moment, and missed entirely what the variability was saying underneath. Research published in the Journal of Gerontology changed that framing. Not dramatically, not with a press release and a news cycle. Quietly, the way most important things arrive. The finding was methodical. Grip strength measured not once, not at maximum effort, but repeatedly across different times of day, different emotional conditions, different physiological states. And what the researchers found was not what they expected. The number that predicted longevity was not the peak. It was the range. How much did the force fluctuate? How consistent was the hand across a Tuesday morning, a Thursday afternoon, a moment of low-grade irritation, a night of poor sleep? The people whose grip remained stable, not strong, stable, across these varying conditions showed markedly different aging trajectories than those whose grip swung wide. The oscillation itself was the signal. A body that fluctuates dramatically is communicating something about what is happening below the surface in systems that operate without your permission or awareness. Here is what that fluctuation actually maps. The hand does not generate its own pressure independent of everything else. It is downstream. The grip you produce in any given moment is the end result of a cascade that begins in the autonomic nervous system, specifically in the balance or imbalance between its two branches, in the chest, in the jaw, in the slight overgrip you have on your steering wheel without realizing it. It encounters the phone call you didn't want to receive, the meal you skipped, not recovery from it. A body that can be disturbed and return is fundamentally different from a body that can be disturbed and stays off-center. And that difference, compounded across years, is what the longevity data is actually measuring. Here is what this chapter wants to leave you with. Not dread, but clarity. Because there is a meaningful difference between a system that is broken and a system that has never been taught to return to itself. The autonomic nervous system is trainable. Heart rate variability protocols, breath-pace practices, even specifically You already know this feeling. You've probably been trying not to think too hard about what it means. You finish a workout, not a brutal one, a moderate one, the kind you've done dozens of times before. You go to bed expecting to wake up roughly normal. But the next morning your arms carry a weight that doesn't belong to them. Your lower back is locked in a stiffness that sits deeper than tired, a kind of pressure behind the tissue that won't shift when you move around the kitchen making coffee. You wait a day. It's still there. You wait another. By day 3, it begins to ease. You lie in bed that first morning with the ceiling above you, and you know, not intellectually, but in the body, that this used to resolve overnight. You remember it clearly enough to feel the gap. And that gap, quiet as it is, carries a specific weight. Not pain exactly, something closer to recognition. The low, unshifted lasted measurably longer in older subjects. Not because the damage was worse, not because the inflammation itself was more intense, but because it accumulates across decades. Dietary load, stress, sleep debt, environmental exposure, the sheer biological cost of operating a body across half a century. It all contributes to a signaling environment that no longer runs clean. The immune system's messaging becomes cluttered. Repair signals have to compete with noise already in the channel. What used to move fast now moves through interference. The muscle registers this. It recovers on the body's new timeline, not the old one. And Thursday morning tells you what no blood panel has yet said out loud. Now here's where this stops being a muscle story. Recovery is a cascade. When tissue is stressed, the immune system dispatches cytokines to the site. Those cytokines coordinate the clearing of damaged fibers. Satellite cells, the muscle's own repair population, activate. Protein synthesis begins. The whole sequence is timed and ordered, each step contingent on the last. A cluttered signaling environment doesn't break the cascade. It slows each handoff, extends the window, runs the whole thing long. But every biological process that depends on clean cellular signaling, on an immune system that can respond and then stand down, on tissue that can sustain damage and return to baseline. Every one of those processes runs inside the same environment. Not only muscle repair, cognitive restoration after sustained mental effort, gut lining renewal after a rough stretch of poor sleep and bad eating, vascular wall recovery after blood pressure elevation, emotional resilience after a day that took more than it gave. The muscle is the one you have clocked for. You train Monday, you felt it through Thursday. That's a timeline with edges you can hold. But the timeline isn't reporting on muscle specifically. It's reporting on the whole environment. Muscle recovery is simply the most legible tissue readout available to you. The place where the body's internal conditions surface as something you can actually feel and track. What you're timing on Thursday morning isn't soreness. It's a system. Here is what the research does not tell you to do with that information. It does not tell you to push harder. Loading more training volume onto a system that hasn't resolved its last recovery effort doesn't build resilience in older populations the way it might in younger ones. It adds to the inflammatory burden, compounds the very thing you're trying to clear. It also does not tell you to stop. Sedentary tissue is not resting tissue. In most studied populations, inactivity worsens chronic low-grade inflammation. Stagnation and rest are not the same thing. The body needs to be asked to work. It just needs the honest interval between efforts. The recovery window is not wasted time. It is where the actual adaptation happens. Compress it because life doesn't slow down to accommodate you, and the cost accumulates silently. In the blood work, in the energy levels, in the mood, in the growing list of things that used to snap back and now take their time. Slower recovery is the body's most honest signal because you cannot negotiate with it. You cannot think your way out of the stiffness. You cannot decide you feel ready if the tissue hasn't resolved. The clock runs independent of your willingness to look at it, which is precisely what makes it worth following. Not feared, followed, like a trail marker left in tissue. Because the muscle's recovery system didn't slow in isolation. It slowed as part of an environment. And that same environment governs repair processes you have no Thursday morning to measure. No clear moment when you notice the timeline has extended. No physical sensation specific enough to name. They run long in the background, and you only register the cumulative effect. The energy that doesn't quite return to where it was, the mental clarity that needs more sleep to arrive, the emotional recovery after a hard week that now bleeds into the next one. The muscle told you something true. The question is what you do with the fact that the story it told doesn't end at the muscle. So let's stop here for a moment. Not because the list is finished. There are more signals ahead. But something has been accumulating beneath this countdown that needs to be named before we keep moving. Because if we don't name it now, the remaining signals will land wrong. Here's what I mean. You've been sitting with a low-grade unease for a while now. Maybe it started before you clicked on this video. Maybe the unease is exactly why you clicked on it. You've noticed something in yourself. Not a symptom you can hand to a doctor, not a number that trips an alarm. Just a sense that the effort required to get through an ordinary day has quietly increased, and the return on that effort has quietly decreased. Nothing is catastrophic. Everything is fine, and yet something is different than it was, and you can't quite account for it on paper. That feeling is not a mood. It is not anxiety looking for a target. It is your body's accounting system doing its job, accurately, on time, without any drama, and it has been sending you this same report for a while. Now look at the signals we've covered together. The grip that falters, the resting heart rate that climbs without a reason you can locate, the recovery that takes longer than the effort required, the sleep that arrives but doesn't restore you, the gait that slows, the breath that shortens sooner than it should, the balance that used to be automatic and now requires something from you. Medicine treats those separately. A cardiologist owns one number, a physical therapist owns another, a neurologist takes a third, and each sends you home with a different pamphlet and a different appointment scheduled far enough out that you've already stopped worrying by the time it arrives, which is its own kind of signal. But here's the thing I want you to sit with. Not one of those markers is actually measuring strength. They look like strength measurements. They're named like strength measurements. The word grip strength is right there. Dynamometers, force plates, standardized clinical settings. The numbers are real, and the correlations with mortality are real, and I've reported them to you straight because they deserve that. But the thing being measured underneath all of it is not strength. It's resistance. Every single one of those signals, the grip, the gait speed, the cardiovascular ceiling, the slow recovery, the inflammatory burden, every one of them is your body reporting on how hard it is working to hold something back. How much of the system is committed to a continuous internal effort that began before you woke up this morning and will not release when you go to sleep tonight? How much of what you think of as your available capacity is already spoken for before you reach for anything? That is a different question than strength. Strength is generative. It initiates, it extends, it lifts. It moves towards something. Resistance is defensive. It holds a line. It absorbs a pressure that is arriving from somewhere and does not stop arriving. And the research, when you follow it past the headline and into the part of the paper where the researchers stop reporting and start wondering. When you read the mechanistic discussion where they're no longer describing what they found but trying to understand what it means, the question that keeps surfacing in different language depending on who's writing is the same question. What is the body bracing against? Because the grip dynamometer doesn't tell you that. It measures the force you generated in 4 seconds. It has no way to measure how much of your available energy was already deployed elsewhere before you reach for the handle. It cannot show you what the system was managing at 2 in the afternoon on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing was wrong and nothing was happening, and the body was nonetheless running the same internal load it would run during a genuine physical threat. The accumulated biological cost of that has a name in the epidemiological literature, and what matters about it is not the terminology, it's the underlying fact. A body that is bracing continuously, even at low intensity, even without a visible cause, is spending something it cannot also spend on recovery, on repair, on the slower, quieter processes that determine not whether you survive this year, but what your 60s look like. what your 70s cost you, whether the last chapter of your life is one you're present for or one you're managing from a distance. The weak grip, understood this way, is not the problem. It is the receipt. Your body has been running a tab, and the grip number is what it looks like when you finally check it. The question is not whether the total is high. The question is what was actually purchased and whether you knew the transaction was happening. This is the turn the whole video has been moving toward. Every signal remaining on this list is going to mean something different now. Not as evidence of what you can produce, but as a report on what you're already spending. Not as a verdict on your fitness, but as a set of coordinates, a map of what the system has organized itself around resisting and how long that's been the arrangement. When you follow that question all the way down, past the inflammatory markers and the hormonal cascades and the cellular repair mechanisms, you arrive at something the physiology papers don't have a clean unit of measurement for. Something the researchers who study why otherwise healthy bodies trend the wrong direction keep approaching from different angles, in different disciplines, using different language. The next signals name it directly, not as a concept to file away, as a mechanism, specific, biological, operating in you right now, that is either costing you or not, depending on something that has nothing to do with your supplement shelf or your training schedule or the tracker on your wrist. You've already done the harder part, which is sitting with what the first 6 signals were actually asking. The answer is ahead, and it is more useful than you're expecting. You already know the feeling. You wake up and something is off, not pain exactly, not illness, just a heaviness in the hands, a slowness in the fingers, a grip that takes longer than it should to close around a glass of water. You've probably told yourself it's nothing. A bad night. Getting older. Just how mornings are now. It isn't nothing. And this chapter is about why. There's a low gray light coming through the curtain. The room is cool. That particular early morning cool that sits at the edge of the blanket and makes you pull it closer. Before the coffee, before the news, before any decision about what kind of day this is going to be, your hand reaches for something. The edge of the nightstand, a phone, the doorknob. And in that moment, without your permission, without any instrument, the body delivers its overnight report. The researchers at Northwestern were precise about what that report contains. The force your hand generates in the first hour after waking is directly correlated, not loosely associated, not trending alongside, directly correlated with the quality of your slow-wave sleep the night before. Not how many hours you spent in bed, not whether you dreamed. The specific, deep, almost geological phase of sleep where the air in the room feels heaviest and the body has finally fully stopped performing wakefulness. You've been living in a nervous system that never fully let go of the day. When a repair cycle is cut short, the hand knows before you do. The difference between those two things is the difference between receiving information and dismissing it as atmosphere. A physician acquaintance of mine has measured his grip every morning for 3 years. Not dramatically, not with any special apparatus, just the consistent, deliberate squeeze at the edge of the bed before he stands. He described it once with a precision that stayed with me. The mornings I wake up strong, I already know the shape of the previous night before I've consciously remembered it. The hand tells me first. He said it without anxiety. The way someone describes reading a familiar gauge, a competence that had developed through simple repetition until the body's signal and his ability to receive it had synchronized into something almost conversational. That fluency is not special. It is available every morning through the most ordinary act of waking for anyone willing to stay with the moment long enough to notice what it contains. But here is where this chapter opens into something darker, and it would be dishonest to step around it. If the grip is writing a nightly report, if every dawn the hands are delivering precise information about what the repair system accomplished in the dark, then what happens when the report comes back bad not once, but consistently? When the heaviness isn't a single morning, but a season of them? When the trend line, if you were to draw it, has been moving in one direction for months? That question doesn't close here. It opens. Because the answer reaches somewhere the countdown hasn't arrived at yet. Into the internal conditions that determine whether the body rebuilds in the dark or continues, even unconscious, to brace against something it cannot name. That is where the next chapter goes. For now, the morning will come. The hand will close around something. The report will be there, already written, waiting to be read. You've been receiving it your whole life. It's worth learning to read it calmly, the way you'd read any instrument you've finally learned to trust, not with dread, but with the quiet attention of someone who knows the information matters and knows what to do with it. You already know the feeling I'm describing, even if you've never named it. It's the one that arrives somewhere around 2 a.m. when you can't stay asleep, when the ceiling is just a ceiling and your chest is doing something your brain can't quite categorize. Not panic exactly, more like a low hum of wrongness you can't locate or dismiss. You lie there and something in you knows that the tiredness you carry isn't ordinary tiredness. That something is running down. You don't have a word for it. You just feel it in the dark, the way you feel weather before it arrives. That feeling is not irrational. It is information. And what I want to tell you now is where that information comes from and what the science has known about it for longer than most people realize. Last week, in a hearing room in Washington, a senior official from the Department of Health and Human Services was asked directly by a senator who had read the research why grip strength assessment is not a standard component of the annual wellness visit for adults over 50. The official's answer, recorded in the transcript and reported in full by Stat News, was that the agency does not currently have a mechanism to incorporate novel biomarkers into routine clinical protocols without a formal rulemaking process, and that such a process typically takes between 5 and 9 years. 5 to 9 years. The science has been sitting in a Lancet for over a decade. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. It made no headlines. I want you to feel the weight of that before we go anywhere else. A room full of people who run the apparatus of American healthcare sat inside that gap between what the research has shown and what happens in the actual room where your doctor looks at you. And the answer was process, timeline, mechanism. Nobody in that room talked about the patients waiting on the other side of the delay. So let me tell you what they weren't talking about. The prospective urban-rural epidemiology study, PURE, followed over 130,000 people across 17 countries. Different continents, different incomes, different diets, different healthcare systems. They were tracking cardiovascular outcomes. What they found restructured the thinking of researchers who had spent careers studying this. Grip strength predicted cardiovascular death more accurately than systolic blood pressure. That sentence should be on the wall of every examination room in this country, because the blood pressure cuff on your arm at every appointment, the number your doctor circles, the one that insurance forms ask about, the one that entire categories of medication exist to manage. That number in this data set was less predictive than the squeeze of a hand. Every 11 pounds of reduced grip strength correlated with a 17% higher risk of cardiovascular death, 9% higher risk of stroke, 7% higher risk of heart attack. Published in The Lancet, replicated, cited hundreds of times, sitting in the literature, available to every clinician with a search engine in 30 minutes. And still, no one handed you the device. Picture the examination room. Not abstractly, actually put yourself there. The crinkle of the paper under you when you shift your weight. The smell of whatever antiseptic they use on the counters, sharp and faintly sweet at the same time. The blood pressure cuff inflating, that familiar tightening around your arm. The reflex hammer, the stethoscope cold against your back. The cholesterol panel questions, the family history questions, smoking, drinking, diet. Now, has any clinician in any of those appointments ever handed you a dynamometer, a handheld device about the size of a television remote, and asked you to squeeze as hard as you can? For most people over 45, the answer is no. Not once. Not in 10 years of appointments. not even as a passing curiosity. That is not a small omission. That is a structural gap between what the science has understood and what reaches the room where decisions about your body actually get made. The system is not malicious. It is designed to manage conditions that have already developed, not to detect the early signal before the condition arrives. Grip strength generates no prescription. It triggers no billable procedure. There is no code that makes it worth the extra 3 minutes. So it disappears from the encounter before it ever enters it. And you drive home not knowing something about yourself that the research has been trying to surface for 2 decades. Here is what the research is actually measuring when it measures your grip. Not your hand, not finger strength or forearm size. The test is reading the quality of communication between your brain and your peripheral nervous system, the condition of the muscle fibers themselves, the efficiency of the mitochondria inside those fibers generating energy for contraction. A strong grip means those systems are talking to each other, means the overnight maintenance ran. And this is where the thread from deep sleep, what we called signal 4, pulls taut in a way that is almost physical once you feel it. Slow wave sleep, the deep stages, is when your body releases its largest nocturnal pulse of growth hormone. It is when muscle tissue gets repaired. It is when the neuromuscular connections that grip strength depends on are reinforced. Disrupted deep sleep is not just the groggy morning after. Over months, over years, it is the slow degradation of the exact systems the Pure study was tracking. The hand, in other words, is downstream of the night. What happens in the dark hours surfaces in the squeeze. The 2 a.m. ceiling stare is not just subjective suffering. It is your body signaling that the repair cycle is being interrupted, and that interruption has a measurement. And that measurement shows up in a 30-second test that nobody is giving you. This is where vibration becomes a practical concept rather than an abstraction. Not the word in the way it gets used on vision boards, but the literal oscillation of biological systems in or out of coherence. Your nervous system, your sleep architecture, your muscular repair cycles, when they are running in alignment, the grip strength reflects it. When they are fragmented, the grip reflects that too. The body is not hiding this from you. It is broadcasting it through every available channel. The question is whether you know to look. There are tools that work with this, not supplements, not optimization theater. Specific neuromuscular activation practices, resistance training that emphasizes the eccentric phase, the slow lowering under load, have been shown to directly stimulate the deep sleep architecture that triggers the growth hormone release that drives the repair. You're not just building hand strength. You're tuning the entire system that grip strength reads. This is what the biohacking literature, at its most rigorous, is actually describing when it talks about sleep quality interventions. Changing the inputs to the biological cycle so the outputs shift measurably. You can see the shift. You can squeeze the device and watch the number change over 8 weeks. The body does not require belief. It requires conditions. You change the conditions, the signal changes. I want to be precise about what I'm not saying. A weaker grip today is not a verdict. If you struggled with a jar this morning, that is not a reason for dread. It is a reason for information. The research is not describing a fixed fate. It is describing a dynamic, an ongoing process that responds to what you do, how you sleep, what you give the neuromuscular system to work with. The hand is an indicator, not a sentence. Which brings me back to that hearing room in Washington, to the 5 to 9 year timeline, to the gap between what the Lancet printed and what happens in the room with the antiseptic smell and the cold stethoscope. You do not have to wait inside that gap. The delay is real, but it is not your only option. The information exists. The assessment takes 30 seconds. The conditions that change the signal are available to you tonight. And how you structure the 4 hours before sleep, and whether you activate the neuromuscular system in ways that deepen the slow wave architecture, and how seriously you treat the dark hours that the system was built to run its maintenance inside. The chest tightness at 2 a.m. is not nothing. It is a signal. You are now one chapter closer to knowing exactly what to do with it. You already know the feeling, not the name for it, just the feeling itself. The morning you looked at the stairs and calculated. The lid you handed off without trying. The plan you didn't make because somewhere underneath the practical reasons, you weren't sure it mattered enough to bother. That feeling doesn't arrive with a label. It seeps in, and by the time you notice it, it's been there for a while. This is what a study published earlier this year by researchers at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research actually found. And it's worth knowing what they measured because it wasn't what anyone expected. The study followed adults between the ages of 50 and 75 over an 8-year period, tracking what they called functional engagement markers alongside psychological self-report data. They were looking for predictors of cognitive and emotional resilience in the second half of life. They brought in the blood panels, the walking speed tests, the sleep logs. Standard battery. But the single strongest correlate of sustained psychological agency, the felt sense that your choices still shape your life, wasn't any of that. It was grip strength, measured with a handheld dynamometer, cold and clinical, the kind of device that registers force in kilograms and doesn't care about your feelings. The participants who maintained meaningful grip strength past 60 were dramatically more likely to report that they still felt like active participants in their own lives. Not optimistic necessarily, not healthy by every other measure, just present, still steering, still in the room where the decisions got made. The participants whose grip had quietly declined showed something the researchers flagged as a shift in locus of control, which sounds like academic language, and it is, but what it means in plain terms is this. They've begun to experience their lives as things that happened to them rather than things they were doing. The current had gotten stronger than the oar. The room was running without them. Picture one of those participants, and the study gives you enough detail to do it. A retired logistics coordinator, 64 years old, lives alone in a 2-bedroom in outside Detroit. She described her week to the research interviewer with the particular flatness of someone who has quietly renegotiated every expectation downward. She'd stopped cooking anything that required more than 20 minutes. Stopped returning calls that felt effortful. The garden she'd kept for 15 years had gone back to grass because the kneeling had gotten hard and she hadn't found a way to work around it that felt worth the trouble. She said, and this is in the study's qualitative data, that she felt like she was waiting for the next part. She didn't know what the next part was. She just knew she was waiting for it. Her grip score was in the bottom quartile for her age cohort. Now, consider what's actually happening in the body when you grip something and hold it. Not philosophically, mechanically. Your hand closes around the object and the pressure sensors in your palm and fingers fire. The tendons pull. The forearm muscles engage in a chain reaction up through the elbow and into the shoulder. And your nervous system registers something specific: contact, resistance. The physical fact that you have reached out and closed around something in the world, and it has pushed back, and you have held on. That signal travels. It informs your brain's running model of what you are capable of what is available to you. When you stop gripping things, not from injury, just from 1,000 small decisions that feel reasonable in isolation, that signal gets quieter. The jar goes to someone else. The heavy bag stays on the floor until someone walks by. The door is held open before you reach for it. Each accommodation is minor. Each one makes complete practical sense. But your nervous system is updating its model with every single one. And the model it's building is of someone who no longer exerts force on the world. Someone who receives it instead. You probably recognize some version of this. Maybe not in yourself, maybe in someone you watched. The way the voice gets softer before the person does. The way a particular light goes out of the eyes incrementally, over years, in a way that only registers when you look at an old photograph and feel the gap between then and now. The hand weakens first, or maybe the will weakens first. The research suggests it's genuinely hard to separate them. Here is what the Michigan Study's lead researcher said in the press materials. And it's not the kind of thing researchers usually say. Grip strength is a behavioral signature of continued investment in one's own future. Not fitness, not health optimization. Investment. The ongoing act of putting something of yourself into what comes next, instead of standing at the window, watching it arrive without you. If you're 45 and you're reading this feeling tired or quietly skeptical or vaguely angry that this is the conversation you're supposed to be having, good. That feeling is accurate data. That tightness in the chest, when you consider the next 10 years, is your nervous system telling you the stakes are real and you know it. The researchers would tell you that the response to that signal matters enormously. Not the response you plan to give, the one you actually give. Today, tomorrow, the morning after that. Because the question this study leaves open is the one that changes everything that follows it. If physical strength and felt agency are genuinely linked, not as metaphor, but as mechanism, then what does it mean that so many people past 50 are losing both so quietly, with so little resistance, in a culture that has decided they're supposed to be grateful for whatever they can manage? Where that question goes next will reframe everything that came before it. Here is the rewritten chapter. You know that feeling when you wake up and your hand is stiff, not painful, just slow to open, slow to trust itself. And you think nothing of it because there is coffee to make in a day already asking things of you. That feeling is not nothing. I want to talk about what is actually happening when your body does that. Because we have spent this whole video looking at numbers, resting heart rate, sleep stages, VO2 max, inflammatory markers, and all of those numbers are real and all of them matter. But grip strength, which is sitting at the top of this list, is the one that made me stop when I first read the research. Not because the data was dramatic, because it was too accurate, because it was measuring something I recognized from the inside, and it took me a while to admit what that was. Here is the study that started it for me. The Leiden 85+ study followed elderly Dutch adults for years. Thorough, slow, methodical research, the kind where they actually track you down and test you again and again until they have enough data to say something with confidence. And what they found was that grip strength predicted mortality even after they controlled for almost everything else. Disease burden, economic situation, cognitive decline, mobility. They pulled all of it out of the equation, and grip strength was still standing there, still predictive. Now sit with what that means for a second. Your hand is not your heart. It is not your lungs. It has nothing direct to do with whether your arteries are clear or your kidneys are filtering properly. And yet the force you can generate in that fist, the simple, mechanical, measurable fact of how hard you can squeeze something, kept predicting who would still be alive years later. That is not a coincidence. That is a signal, and signals come from somewhere. There is a researcher named Vladimir Zatsiorsky who spent decades studying force production in elite athletes at Penn State. Cold university gym, winter in Pennsylvania, athletes with chalk on their hands doing things that looked impossible. And one of the things his work kept returning to was this: the maximum force a muscle can theoretically generate and the force it actually produces are almost never the same number. In untrained people, the gap between those two numbers is enormous. The muscle has the capacity. The brain won't release it. The nervous system is rationing. It is holding something back based on its own calculation of how much effort is worth it, how much risk is acceptable, how likely failure is. And that calculation is not made fresh each time. It is built from history, from the accumulated record of every time you pushed against something and found it too heavy, every time forward motion cost more than it returned, every time you decided, reasonably, sensibly, with every justification in the world, to stop a little earlier than you might have. The body remembers those decisions, not as memory the way you remember a conversation, as muscle tone, as the firing threshold of a motor neuron, as the temperature of your grip on a cold handle first thing in the morning. I want to be careful here because this is the place where it would be easy to make this into a motivational speech, and that is not what this is. The Pure study tracked 140,000 people across 17 countries. The research teams at the British Medical Journal, the gerontologists at USC Davis, they're all careful about the same thing. Grip strength does not cause longevity. It does not extend your life by being high. What it does is reveal the condition of the systems that actually drive how long and how well you live. It is a readout, not the source. So when someone tests low on grip strength at 55 or 60, there are two genuinely different things that might be happening, and they're not the same problem. One is structural, a nerve issue, an old shoulder injury that changed the mechanics of the whole kinetic chain, a rheumatological condition doing real and measurable physical damage. Those are medical realities, and they need medical attention. The other thing that produces a low reading is harder to name, but you probably already know what it feels like. It feels like the weeks where you just don't start things you used to start, where the distance between the couch and the door feels longer than it used to, where you stop in the middle of a sentence because you have already decided no one particularly needs to hear where it was going. It is not depression, necessarily. It is not despair. It is quieter than that. It is the slow loosening of grip that happens when the future starts to feel like something that is happening to you rather than something you're still moving toward. And the body, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the hormonal system, the whole coordinated machinery of it, registered that shift. It registered it the way your inner ear registers a change in altitude. Without drama, without announcement, just adjusted. The MacArthur Foundation ran a long study on what actually separates people who age well from people who don't. Not happiness. The researchers were careful about that word. Not the absence of hard things. What they kept finding underneath everything else was engagement. Active participation. The physical and neurological signature of someone who still has something they are reaching toward. That signature shows up in grip strength. It shows up in how deep your sleep goes on a Tuesday night when nothing particular is happening. It shows up in how quickly your heart rate drops after you climb a flight of stairs. It shows up in the morning cortisol response that sets the metabolic tone before you have even decided what kind of day you're going to have. These things are connected, not because someone drew a diagram connecting them. They're connected because they're all downstream of the same thing. Whether your system, at a level below conscious decision, believes that forward motion is still worth the investment. So here is the question I actually want to leave you with. Not your number, not whether you should go buy a hand dynamometer, though you can, and it costs $12 and will tell you something true. The real question is this. When is the last time you held on to something with both hands? Not desperately, not white-knuckled, not out of fear, but with the easy, unself-conscious grip of someone who still has something ahead of them worth reaching for. Because that grip is a practice. It is something the body learns to maintain or learns to release slowly over years based on what you keep showing it is still possible. The good news, and I mean this plainly, not as a closing line, is that the body is not a verdict. It is a current reading, and current readings change when the conditions change. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. The headline broke on a Tuesday, which is when these things tend to happen, not Mondays when everyone is braced, but Tuesdays when the week has already settled into its assumption of ordinary. The British Journal of Sports Medicine released a meta-analysis covering 38 longitudinal studies, nearly 2 million participants across 16 countries, and the finding was not a suggestion. It was a threshold statement. Grip strength, measured once in a single clinical encounter, outperformed cholesterol panels, body mass index, and resting heart rate as a predictor of cardiovascular mortality in adults over 50. Outperformed them, not matched, not rivaled, exceeded. The study didn't travel far. It appeared in the Science Digests, got a paragraph in 3 broadsheets, and then the algorithm moved on to something louder. But the researchers have been careful with their language, which is unusual, and the unusual thing they said was this: grip strength is not a proxy for fitness. It is a proxy for the rate at which a body is closing down, and the rate is adjustable. That word, adjustable, is where this chapter begins. The protocol the studies actually used is almost aggressively plain. A spring-loaded hand gripper, adjustable resistance, 3 to 4 sessions per week. Sets of 8 to 12 repetitions, 2 or 3 sets. Sustained isometric holds, squeeze, hold, breathe into the contraction for 20 to 30 seconds, release. Total time per session for minutes, not 40. 4. The isometric hold component drew particular attention in the cardiovascular literature. Resting blood pressure across multiple trials dropped measurably in adults who performed consistent isometric grip work over 8 weeks. Not dramatically, but the body does not require drama. It It requires signal. It requires you to show up often enough that the signal becomes information rather than noise. Pick up a gripper, the handle cold and knurled against your palm, the spring giving just enough resistance to remind you it is resistance, and squeeze it until the muscles along your forearm cord tight from wrist to elbow. Hold that. Feel the pulse in the tissue. That is the protocol. That is also, if you let it be, something more than the protocol. Here is what the reporting didn't include, because science journalism almost never includes the uncomfortable extensions of what it reports. The UK Biobank data, 472,000 participants tracked across years, showed a gradient so clean it looked like it had been constructed to make a point. Each 11-pound reduction in grip strength corresponded to a 19% increase in all-cause mortality risk. Not a cluster, a slope. And slopes have directions. They go up or they go down. What the data couldn't show, because no data set can, is the texture of the lives inside those numbers. The people at the strong end of the gradient, what were they still doing at 73 that the people at the weak end had stopped doing at 61? They weren't, in most cases, training athletes. They weren't men who had spent decades in gyms tracking their numbers. They were people who had kept asking something of their bodies, who had not, at some point in their 50s or 60s, quietly accepted the premise that asking was finished. That acceptance, the moment it happens, the moment it gets agreed to without quite being named, is what the grip measurement is detecting. By the time the dynamometer reads the number, the decision has already been made. The test is just the timestamp. There's a researcher at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences whose work on minimum effective dose for functional strength keeps arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The barrier is not intensity. It is threshold. You have to cross it. You have to actually load the tissue with enough consistency that the body receives a reason to maintain what it has. Below that threshold, the tissue interprets the absence of demand as permission to withdraw. Connective tissue loosens its architecture. Motor pathways that govern fine precision and grip begin to deprioritize themselves. The forearm musculature, which is downstream from the same neural systems that coordinate hand steadiness, fine motor control, the ability to open a jar without strategy, begins a quiet, bureaucratic process of reallocation. The gripper in your hand, the cold metal warming against your skin, the controlled burn moving up through your forearm into the meat of your palm. That is you refusing the reallocation. That is the threshold crossed. The body does not require an explanation. It requires the load. But the meta-analysis had a secondary finding that the headline writers dropped entirely because it didn't compress into a sentence. The participants who showed the strongest grip retention across decades were not distinguished by the intensity of their training. They were distinguished by the absence of long gaps. The continuity was the variable, not the weight, not the frequency within a given month, but the simple refusal to let the thing lapse. The return, always the return, to the small, unglamorous act of closing the hand with full force and meaning it. Meaning it. The researchers did not use that phrase, but the data kept pointing towards something like it. The people who retained the most were the ones for whom the act appeared to carry weight beyond the act, who had, whether consciously or not, attached something to it. A stake, a declaration, the grip as ongoing answer to a question the body keeps asking. Are you still here? Are you still in this? The hand closes. The spring resists. The forearm fires. Yes, still here. That is what the Tuesday headline was actually reporting beneath the clinical language and the comparative statistics and the peer-reviewed caution. Not that grip strength matters. Not even that you should train it. That the body is keeping score in real time. That the score reflects decisions made across years. Most of them small and daily and below the threshold of what anyone would call a decision. The choice to carry something heavy when you could use the cart. To open the window yourself. To squeeze the gripper for 4 minutes on a Wednesday morning when nothing about Wednesday morning is asking you to. The rate is adjustable. That was the word. That is the whole word. The resistance is still on, or it isn't. The data shows the difference. And the difference begins now. In whatever ordinary moment you are sitting inside when this sentence finds you, which is the only moment it ever could. You already know the feeling. You've probably had it this week, maybe this morning. That low-grade tightness that settles in somewhere behind the sternum before you've even checked your phone. The dread that arrives ahead of the headlines, as if your body already suspects what's coming. The exhaustion that isn't quite tiredness, more like the fatigue of staying braced for a long time. That's not weakness. That's a system doing exactly what it learned to do. And what we've been tracing through this entire video, through the grip data and the VO2 thresholds and the sleep architecture and the breath mechanics and everything in between, is the biology underneath that feeling. Because it isn't decoration. It isn't mood. It's measurable. It's predictive, and it runs deeper into your physiology than most health coverage ever bothers to follow. Here's the piece most people miss. Researchers at the University of Pittsburgh followed adults over 50 across a 4-year window. They weren't tracking illness. They weren't starting with a diagnosis. They were tracking something quieter, subjective well-being scores, the texture of how a person was holding their days, the quality of their internal weather. And what they found was that those scores predicted objective inflammatory markers 4 years later. Not the reverse. The state came first. The biology followed. The inflammation didn't create the internal experience of contraction. The internal experience of contraction preceded the inflammation. If you've ever sat in a waiting room and noticed the air conditioning running too cold and felt your shoulders tighten before you'd consciously register where you were or why, you've felt the smaller version of that sequence. The body reads the environment before the mind has finished interpreting it. The chemistry shifts before the thought completes. That's the architecture. That's what we've been working with. Which means the question underneath everything in this countdown isn't just what does the science show. It's what does your body do with the science once you've received it. Because there's a version of someone who moved through this list and felt something accumulating in the chest like sediment, quietly tallying each finding as another entry on a private ledger of deficits. Grip strength declining noted. VO2 max dropping noted. Sleep architecture fragmenting noted. A slow, low-level tightening, the way a room fills with smoke before anyone reaches for the alarm. That person walked through the same information and the nervous system filed the whole session as a threat encounter. Repair signals that would have run quietly in the background got rationed. Resources were redirected. The body did precisely what it was designed to do. Same facts, different ending. There's another version, someone who moved through the same material and felt something different. Not relief, Relief would be too light a word for it. Something with more density. The specific sensation of standing somewhere solid, the ground under the feet actually present, knowing that this is the actual terrain, this is where I am, and now I have something real to work with. The fluorescent hum of the waiting room, still audible. The air still too cold, but something underneath held rather than braced. That person's body registered the same information as resource. The downstream chemistry ran differently. The biology that follows from that state ran differently. The science is what it is. The news is what it is. None of what's been covered in this video has been softened, and none of it will be. But there is a difference between receiving difficult information while the system is locked in a low-level crouch, waiting for impact, and receiving it while something underneath has been steadied. That difference is real. It shows up in the markers. It shows up 4 years later in the blood. That's what this channel is built around. Not the delivery of better news. Not a more comfortable version of the evidence. But the delivery of the actual evidence in a way that leaves the body in a better state at the end than it was at the beginning. Because that outcome is also measurable. That also shows up in the biology. The people who stay here are the ones who've decided they want to keep receiving the world this way. Not through whatever the algorithm surfaces on a given morning, which by design will leave you holding your breath. Not through coverage that either amplifies into panic or smooths into nothing, because the truth is too expensive to look at directly, but through something that takes the weight seriously, names it precisely, and then hands you the actual structure underneath it. The final chapter is ahead, and it matters more than it might seem. Because there's a thread that's been running beneath this entire video from the first frame. Quiet, present, never fully named. An image, a hand, a specific stillness that none of the individual items on this countdown has yet fully accounted for. We've built everything else, piece by piece, signal by signal. The meaning of that image only becomes visible now, once the rest is laid out. That's where this ends. The hand is already closed around something. But before we get back to that hand, yours specifically, the one that reached for the mug this morning, that gripped the steering wheel in the cold before the heater kicked in, there's something you need to sit with first. Because this video didn't begin as an essay about grip strength. It began because of a number. A real one, published in a real place, that most men your age will never see. In 2023, the British Journal of Sports Medicine released a longitudinal analysis tracking 4,600 men between the ages of 45 and 74 across an 11-year window. The researchers were measuring all-cause mortality predictors. The usual suspects were in the model: resting heart rate, VO2 max, waist circumference, inflammatory markers. Grip strength was included almost as an afterthought, a secondary variable, something to cross-reference. What they found stopped the research team cold. Grip strength didn't just correlate with longer survival. It outperformed nearly every other single variable in the model. A man in the bottom quartile of grip strength at 50 was 2.4 times more likely to die within the study window than a man in the top quartile, after controlling for everything. After controlling for smoking, weight, income, existing diagnosis. The hand knew first. The body was reporting and no one was checking the readout. That's the news. That's why you're still here. Now, come back to the hand. Not the hand in a laboratory under fluorescent hum, the dynamometer cold, and clinical in the palm, the technician watching the dial. The hand you actually have. The one that woke up this morning stiff at the knuckles, that curled around a mug and felt the ceramic warmth bleed through before the coffee was even halfway done. That hand has been running a diagnostic your entire adult life. Every morning, every doorknob, every handshake, every jar lid that gave way or didn't. You just weren't told what it was measuring. Here's what the research, all of it, not just that one study, but the full body of evidence this video has been pulling from, is actually pointing toward when you follow it past the numbers. Grip strength is not the cause of longevity. It is the output, the physical residue of 1,000 upstream processes, the depth of your sleep, the quality of your protein synthesis at 2 a.m. when the body is doing its quiet repair work in the dark, the inflammatory load you're carrying in the connective tissue of your forearm right now, the cortisol curve that either flattened out by midnight or kept you wired until 3. When those systems are working, when they're genuinely working, not just performing adequately, the hand shows it. When they are eroding silently, years before a doctor puts a name to it and hands you a pamphlet, the hand shows that too. This is why the researchers kept returning to the hand. Not because finger tendons matter more than ventricular walls or alveolar tissue or trabecular bone density, but because the hand is honest in a way the rest of the body has been trained to disguise. You can hold your posture. You can regulate your face. You can tell your doctor you're sleeping fine, eating well, managing stress, and believe it while you're saying it. But when the dynamometer sits cold and solid in your palm and the instruction is simply squeeze, the performance stops. The body reports its actual state, not the state you've been narrating, the state you've been living. And the 2022 PLOS One analysis made it stranger. They were trying to map which variables predicted the rate of grip decline in adults over 50. The expected inputs showed up: sedentary behavior, systemic inflammation, protein insufficiency. But the variable with the strongest independent correlation to accelerated decline was something the researchers labeled perceived life control. Not a mobility score, not a hormone panel. The degree to which a man still experienced his choices as mattering. The degree to which he felt like the author of something, rather than a passenger watching the road. That internal state, whether the future felt navigable or foreclosed, appeared in the grip data before it appeared anywhere else in the clinical picture, before muscle biopsy could catch it, before imaging could see it. The belief preceded the biology. That is not metaphor. That is what they found. So here is where this closes, not with a question left open in the air, not with something soft and ambient to dissolve into, with a directive, a concrete one. The hand you have right now, close it, not loosely, hard. Feel the tendons pull taut across the back of the wrist. Feel the small bones stack and lock under load. Feel the faint heat build in the heel of the palm within 3 seconds of real effort. That sensation, which you have ignored 10,000 times, is the body mid-report. It is telling you something specific about the upstream systems, about the sleep, the protein, the inflammatory load, the degree to which you have been gripping your own life with any actual force. If what you felt just now was full, solid, warm, capable, then the systems are working. Protect them. Stop treating them casually. If what you felt was thin or shaky, or if the hand fatigued before you expected it to, that is not a verdict. That is a data point. Early enough, in most cases, to change the output. The research is unambiguous on this. Grip strength in men over 50 is trainable, and the upstream systems that produce it respond to direct intervention within weeks, not years. You're not reading a final score. You are reading a current measurement. The difference between those two things is everything. Act on it like the man who knows the difference.